The human cost. When the documents were shredded and the hearings concluded, Project MKUltra became a scandal in history books. But for the people inside it, it never became history. It remained personal. Behind every budget request and classified authorization was a human being who walked into a room expecting care, education, or opportunity, not experimentation. Some were psychiatric patients searching for stability. Some were prisoners offered incentives. Some were students volunteering for what they believed were harmless studies. Some were ordinary citizens placed in unusual circumstances without full understanding. Many trusted the authority in front of them. That trust was the doorway. In controlled rooms and clinical settings, substances were administered in ways participants did not fully comprehend. Sessions were structured as research. Procedures were described in professional language. Yet the underlying objective was not treatment, it was control, endurance, psychological manipulation, or behavioral influence. The mind is not simply a system of nerves. It is memory. It is identity. It is perception. It is the quiet voice that says, "This is who I am." When altered without informed consent, the effects are not just chemical, they are existential. Some individuals later described deep confusion following their involvement. Others experienced anxiety that lingered long after participation ended. A few reported memory gaps, blurred recollections, or emotional instability that seemed disconnected from their previous lives. Whether every detail can be fully reconstructed decades later is uncertain. But what remains clear is this:
consent was compromised.
In many cases, participants were not fully informed of the nature, intensity, or purpose of what they were experiencing. Some were not informed at all. The ethical foundation that should protect research subjects was weakened under the pressure of Cold War urgency. And urgency can distort judgment. The climate of fear surrounding psychological warfare created justification. Officials believed adversaries were exploring similar techniques. The narrative became one of necessity, that understanding the limits of the human mind was essential to national survival. But necessity does not erase responsibility. Hospitals are meant to heal. Universities are meant to educate. Government institutions are meant to protect citizens. When those spaces become experimental environments without transparency, the consequences ripple outward. For victims, the impact was rarely dramatic in a cinematic sense. It was quieter. It appeared in sleepless nights, in sudden waves of distrust, in strained relationships, in questions without answers. Imagine sensing that something inside you changed, your confidence, your emotional balance, your memory, but being told nothing unusual occurred. Imagine years later learning that a classified program may have shaped that experience. That realization can be destabilizing in its own way. When congressional investigations in the 1970s revealed fragments of MKUltra, survivors began connecting pieces. What once felt isolated became part of a pattern. What once seemed unbelievable became documented. But documentation was incomplete. In 1973, many MKUltra files were deliberately destroyed. That act ensured that countless stories would remain partially hidden. Without records, victims struggled to prove involvement. Without proof, accountability weakened. Some individuals sought legal recourse. A few settlements were reached. Some acknowledgments were issued. Yet financial compensation cannot restore lost time. It cannot fully repair fractured trust. It cannot reconstruct memories that were blurred. And trust was perhaps the greatest casualty. The program often targeted vulnerable populations, those less likely to challenge authority or be believed if they did. Institutionalized patients. Individuals with limited social power. People already navigating personal struggles. Power tends to operate most freely where resistance is minimal. That pattern is not unique to MKUltra. It is a recurring warning throughout history. The ethical line is crossed gradually. A justification here, a waiver there, a belief that oversight can wait. For the individuals involved, However, there was nothing gradual about the personal aftermath. Some described feeling detached from their own experiences. Others struggled to explain their participation to friends or family. Before public exposure, claims of secret experiments could be dismissed as fantasy. That skepticism added another layer of isolation. When the truth emerged, validation arrived, but often decades late. Some victims passed away before hearing official acknowledgement. Others testified, voices steady, but marked by years of uncertainty. They were not seeking spectacle. Many simply wanted recognition, to be heard,
To be believed. To know that what happened to them mattered.
It is important to acknowledge that experiences varied. Not every participant reported long-term harm. Human resilience differs. Memory evolves. Perception shifts over time. But ethical standards exist precisely because outcomes cannot be predicted. Informed consent is not symbolic. It is the foundation of dignity. It ensures that individuals retain agency over their own bodies and minds. It protects autonomy. It establishes trust between institutions and citizens. When consent is absent, even the appearance of legitimacy cannot justify the act. Modern research oversight systems, ethics boards, review committees, transparent protocols were strengthened in response to past abuses, including MKUltra. Safeguards improved. Accountability increased. Reform is important, but reform does not erase harm. The victims of MKUltra were not enemies. They were not foreign operatives. They were individuals living ordinary lives who encountered extraordinary secrecy. Their stories transform MKUltra from an abstract intelligence program into a human narrative. A narrative about vulnerability, about power, about the cost of fear-driven decisions. History often remembers leaders and strategies, but it must also remember the individuals whose lives were altered quietly, without headlines. Because without them, the story becomes clinical. With them, it becomes moral. The Cold War ended. The program ended. The documents were scattered or destroyed. Yet the lesson endures. Security cannot come at the expense of dignity. Progress cannot override consent. Power cannot operate indefinitely without oversight. The victims stand as a reminder that every policy decision touches real lives. And when institutions forget that, history repeats its warnings in painful ways. Project MKUltra may exist now as a chapter in archives. But for those who lived through it, it was never just a chapter. It was part of their identity. And remembering them ensures that the human cost is never reduced to a footnote. The architects. If it was about the victims, then this must confront a more uncomfortable question. Who allowed it to happen? Not in abstract terms, not as a faceless institution, but as individuals. Project MKUltra did not run itself. It required signatures, approvals, budgets, meetings in quiet offices where decisions were framed as strategic necessities. The architects of the program were not cartoon villains. They were educated professionals, intelligence officials, researchers, administrators, operating in a climate shaped by Cold War fear. That fear mattered. In the 1950s and 1960s, the United States believed psychological warfare was evolving rapidly. Reports of foreign brainwashing, prisoner confessions, and ideological conditioning created urgency. The idea that an enemy could control the human mind was deeply unsettling. And so the question became, what if they discover it first? In that environment, experimentation began to feel like preparation. Preparation began to feel like defense. And defense began to justify secrecy. The architects of MKUltra operated within this logic. They saw themselves as protecting national security. They believed they were preventing catastrophe. Some likely convinced themselves that temporary ethical compromises were necessary to avoid larger threats. History shows that moral lines are rarely erased overnight. They fade gradually. A research proposal framed carefully. A risk assessment minimized. An internal discussion that concludes, the stakes are too high to hesitate. Once that mindset takes hold, oversight weakens. The structure of MKUltra reflected compartmentalization. Projects were divided. Funding was routed through front organizations. Universities and research institutions sometimes received grants without full knowledge of their origin. This fragmentation served a purpose. If no one sees the entire picture, accountability becomes difficult. Compartmentalization protects operations, but it also diffuses responsibility. When exposure finally came, many individuals claimed limited awareness. Some insisted they believed their work was legitimate. Others emphasized the context of the Cold War. And context does matter. But context does not erase choice. At every stage, someone reviewed proposals. Someone approved budgets. Someone authorized continuation. Institutional momentum can be powerful, but it is built from individual decisions. Some professionals involved in related research later expressed discomfort. Some distanced themselves when details became clearer. A few acknowledged that lines had been crossed, but others defended the program as a product of its time. That phrase, a product of its time, appears often in historical analysis. It suggests inevitability. It implies that under those conditions anyone might have acted the same way. Yet history also shows that even in fearful eras, dissent exists. Ethical resistance exists. Individuals refuse participation. Whistleblowers emerge. The presence of fear does not eliminate moral agency. The architects of MKUltra were not operating in total darkness. Ethical standards for medical research were already evolving. The importance of informed consent was not an unknown concept. The decision to bypass it was deliberate. And that is the core tension. Security versus principle. Urgency versus restraint. Power versus accountability. When congressional investigations began in the 1970s, the public demanded answers. Hearings revealed financial trails, destroyed documents, and the scope of the program. But consequences were limited. Few faced serious penalties. Few careers ended dramatically. Institutions adapted and continued. For many observers, this raised another concern. If accountability is minimal, what prevents repetition? The architects may have believed they were defending their nation, but in doing so, they tested the limits of democratic oversight. Democracy depends on transparency, on checks and balances, on the idea that no program is beyond scrutiny. MKUltra thrived in secrecy. It expanded because few outside a small circle knew it existed. Secrecy can be necessary in intelligence work, but secrecy without boundaries becomes a shield for ethical erosion. The architects operated within a system that rewarded results and minimized exposure. Success was measured in data gathered, not in moral integrity preserved. That incentive structure matters. When institutions prioritize outcomes above ethics, individuals adapt accordingly. Yet responsibility cannot be dissolved into structure alone. Every program is ultimately human-driven. Someone drafts the memo. Someone signs the authorization. Someone decides that oversight can be bypassed. And someone at some point chooses not to stop it. This does not require villainy. It requires rationalization. The belief that the mission outweighs the method. The belief that history will understand. The belief that the ends justify the means. MKUltra reveals how dangerous that belief can become. Because once the means are compromised, the ends themselves are altered. The program did not produce reliable mind control techniques. It did not create a strategic breakthrough. It produced controversy, mistrust, and long-term ethical damage. The architects likely did not begin with malicious intent. But intent does not define impact. Impact defines legacy. And the legacy of MKUltra is not technological advancement. It is caution. Caution about unchecked authority. Caution about fear-driven policy. Caution about systems that reward secrecy over scrutiny. The architects were products of their era, but they were also decision-makers within it. Their story forces us to confront a difficult reality. Abuses of power do not require extraordinary villains. They require ordinary people in positions of authority who convince themselves that compromise is necessary. And that realization may be more unsettling than any classified document, because it suggests that the line between protection and violation is not guarded by titles or credentials. It is guarded by ethics. When those ethics weaken, even the most sophisticated institutions can drift into darkness. The files may be gone. The architects may be gone. The Cold War may be over. But the question remains timeless. When fear rises again, who will draw the line?